Somewhere in Tennessee, right now, at 6 in the morning, paint booths are humming. Stamping presses are dropping with a force you can feel in your chest from the parking lot. A robot arm is welding a quarter panel onto a brand new Cadillac. This plant is not a ruin. It is not rusting behind a chain link fence. General Motors has poured over $4 billion into it since 2010. New tooling, new battery lines, a fresh $275 million investment announced this year. By every number that matters to General Motors, this factory is a success story. So here's the question that should bother you. If the building never failed, if the workers never left, if the money never stopped coming in, then why does almost nobody alive today remember the name that was supposed to be cast into the concrete under its north wing? Because this building was not built for Cadillac. It was built for a car company that doesn't exist anymore. A company that once had strangers driving 1,000 miles from every state in the country just to say thank you in person. It wasn't a failed factory that killed that company. The factory never failed. It was a boardroom 400 miles north that decided the building should keep running, and the name on it shouldn't. This is the story of Saturn. And it is not a story about a car that failed. It's a story about a promise that got murdered by the very company that made it. To understand why Saturn had to die, you first have to understand how strange it was that Saturn was ever allowed to live. In the early 1980s, General Motors was still, on paper, the biggest automaker on Earth, and it was bleeding small car buyers to Toyota and Honda so fast that even GM's own executives were rattled. In 1982, a GM vice president named Alex Mayer pulled a handful of engineers into a room and asked the one question Detroit had been too scared to answer honestly for a decade. Could an American company actually build a small car people wanted at a price the Japanese couldn't beat without losing money on every single one? Mayer's team said yes. GM's chairman, Roger B. Smith, went public with it in November 1983. On January 7th, 1985, Saturn Corporation was born. Not a trim level, not a badge slapped on an existing car, but its own subsidiary, its own engineers, its own labor contract, eventually its own zip code. Smith called it a clean sheet of paper. He committed $1.9 billion just to build the plant, $3.5 billion for the whole bet, on an idea that, at the time, was barely more than a concept car and a stack of diagrams. 38 communities across America begged to host it. On July 30th, 1985, the winner was announced, Spring Hill, Tennessee, a farming town that had only just crossed a population of 1,000 people, known until that point for old plantation houses and quiet farmland. Within weeks, land prices in the county doubled overnight. Farms that had sat in the same families for generations sold for numbers nobody there had ever seen. A town defined entirely by its past was about to become the launchpad for one of the most idealistic bets in the history of American industry. It took 5 years to turn that idealism into metal. The first team members moved to Spring Hill in February 1986. United Auto Workers technicians signed on under a contract that was, for Detroit, almost unthinkable, built on cooperation instead of the decades-old war between labor and management, with joint committees and profit sharing written directly into the deal. On July 30th, 1990, 5 years to the week after Spring Hill won the bid, the first Saturn rolled off the line, Roger Smith sat behind the wheel. Beside him, in the passenger seat, sat UAW President Owen Bieber. Sit with that image for a second. 1 year earlier, Roger Smith had become the villain of Michael Moore's Roger and Me, the face of GM abandoning Flint, Michigan after mass layoffs. Now here he was, in the same decade, sharing a front seat with the head of the same union, at the birth of what was supposed to be proof that GM hadn't given up on American workers after all. The first Saturn dealership opened in Memphis, and the pitch was almost defiantly unfashionable for 1990. One price on the windshield. No haggling, no games. Dealers started handing owners a flower every time they came in for service. A tiny gesture that sounds quaint now, but in 1990, against a backdrop of car lots most Americans genuinely dreaded, was a small revolution. Toyota and Honda would later copy pieces of it. In 1990, it belonged to Saturn alone. Every brand that falls has one product you have to fall in love with first, the thing that has to break your heart later. For Saturn, that was the S-Series, and specifically the SL2 sedan. It launched in 1991 at $10,990, around $25,000 to $26,000 today. Dent-resistant polymer body panels turned a showroom demo into a magic trick. A door ding that would permanently scar a steel car would just pop back into shape on a Saturn. Small detail, enormous emotional payoff. It told buyers in one demonstration that this company had actually thought about what happens to their car after the sale. Popular Science named Saturn one of the year's greatest science and technology achievements. By 1991, Saturn had the highest sales per dealership of any brand in America. The first time in 15 years, a domestic nameplate had beaten the imports at their own game. Not a marketing claim, a fact. And the love wasn't manufactured. It showed up in the numbers that actually matter. Owner satisfaction scores among the highest in the industry, year after year. And then came something no car company had ever tried: the homecoming. Owners driving across state lines, sometimes across the entire country, back to a Tennessee factory, just to see where their car was born and shake hands with the people who built it. Tens of thousands of them actually did it. Caravans on Highway 31, license plates from a dozen states, rolling toward a car plant like it was a pilgrimage site. By June 1995, the 1 millionth Saturn rolled off the line. By 2001, cumulative sales had crossed 2.2 million, with nearly 8,000 people working at Spring Hill. The single best year, 1994, saw 286,000 Saturns sold. A brand new American company competing against manufacturers with 60 years of history, beating the Japanese on their own turf, using nothing but a fair price and a friendly showroom. If you didn't already know how this story ends, you'd assume right here that Saturn was permanent. That assumption is exactly the trap the next 15 years were built to spring. Here's the detail most versions of the story skip. Saturn was never, legally, its own company. No public stock, no outside investors, no equity for the workers who built it or the dealers who staked their names on it. GM's own 1986 annual report said it plainly. Saturn was a wholly owned subsidiary. Every major decision still needed sign-off from a boardroom in Detroit. The independence was operational. The ownership never left GM's hands. And whatever a parent company grants, a parent company can quietly take back. For a decade, GM mostly left Saturn alone, and it worked. But by the early 2000s, the erosion started. Not with one dramatic memo, but with a slow pile-up of small decisions, each one individually defensible. GM began pushing Saturn onto shared corporate platforms to cut costs. The View SUV, launched in 2002, was the first Saturn built on a global GM architecture instead of a dedicated Saturn design, engineered largely in Detroit, not Spring Hill. In 2006, GM started building Chevrolet Equinoxes on the very same factory floor. Small change, enormous symbolism. Meanwhile, the S-Series, the car that started it all, went 12 years, 1991 to 2002, without a real redesign, while Korean and Japanese rivals refreshed theirs every few years. The brand that once beat Toyota to the punch on customer experience was now waiting in line behind Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, Cadillac, GMC, Hummer, and Saab for scraps of GM's engineering budget. Saturn wasn't killed by one catastrophic failure. It was killed by 1,000 small withdrawals of the exact independence that had made it special. Each one too small for any single executive to ever have to sign a document that said, "We are ending Saturn." Every dying company tries something. Saturn tried almost everything, which is what makes watching this in hindsight so painful. This wasn't a brand that gave up. It kept swinging for the better part of a decade and kept missing. 1999, the L-Series, Saturn's first real mid-size sedan, built to fight the Camry and Accord. It cost $1.5 billion and shared far more engineering with other GM cars than the original S-Series ever had. It never caught on. Gone by 2004, 5 years for a car that cost $1.5 billion to build. 2002, the View, Saturn's first crossover, built on a shared global platform. Sold fine, moved nobody. 2003, the Eon replaced the aging S-Series, and reviewers largely called it a step backward. A car built to hit a price point, not to make anyone fall in love. The exact opposite of what made the SL2 special. 2005, a minivan, the Relay, openly sharing its bones with other GM models. 2006, a sports car, the Sky, chasing an audience that had nothing to do with Saturn's original no-haggle family sedan identity. By 2007, Saturn was rebadging European Opel designs as its own. The Astra arrived in 2008, built on GM's global small car architecture, not anything designed in Spring Hill. In less than 2 decades, Saturn had gone from clean sheet of paper to selling a rebadged German hatchback. None of it moved the needle. And in a bitter twist, Saturn even launched briefly in Japan during this stretch. A company built to beat Japan at its own game, arriving in Japan the exact moment Japan's economy stopped cooperating with anyone's plans, including its own. Every fallen brand story needs a villain, and the lazy answer here is the market. Cheap Japanese competition, shifting tastes, an industry in flux. That answer isn't wrong. It's just a convenient way to avoid naming names. Markets don't sign termination papers. People in specific rooms on specific days do. By 2009, GM itself was collapsing. Chapter 11 that summer, one of the largest industrial bankruptcies in American history. Under new CEO Fritz Henderson, GM started deciding, brand by brand, what was worth saving. Saturn, Pontiac, Hummer, and Saab were all marked for disposal. For Saturn, there was briefly a real lifeline. In June 2009, Penske Automotive Group, Roger Penske's retail empire, agreed in principle to buy the Saturn brand and its dealer network outright. GM would keep building the Aura, View and Outlook under contract for a transition period while Penske took over sales. For a few months that summer, it looked like Saturn might finally get the real independence it had been promised on paper back in 1985. Then, on September 30th, 2009, Penske walked away. The deal had depended on lining up a manufacturer to keep building Saturns once GM's contracted supply ran out, reportedly Renault. Renault's board rejected it. With no confirmed source of future cars, Penske pulled out the same day. Fritz Henderson's statement that afternoon was almost gentle. Disappointing news after months of work by dedicated employees and dealers trying to build a future for the brand. But the outcome was immediate and total. GM simply wound the brand down. No second buyer was sought. No backup plan pursued. Roughly 13,000 dealership jobs put at risk in a single afternoon. This is the actual villain of this story. Not the Japanese competitors of 1985. Not the 2008 recession. The specific 2009 choice made inside a bankrupt GM boardroom to let one failed negotiation end a 24-year-old American brand, rather than spend even a few more months looking for a second option. Is that understandable? Sure. GM was drowning in 100 more urgent fires that summer. But understandable isn't the same as inevitable. It was still a choice made by specific people in a specific room, and a different choice in that same room could have written a different ending for 13,000 people who'd built their livelihoods on a promise. Here's what makes Saturn's ending different from almost every other dead brand story. The factory didn't become a ruin. No broken windows, no pigeons in the rafters, no abandoned shell rotting behind a fence. Since 2010, GM has poured more than $2 billion into keeping this plant running under other names. In 2020, another $2 billion to retool it for EV production, including the Cadillac Lyriq. GM and LG added a $2.3 billion battery plant right next door. Today the site builds the Cadillac XT5, XT6, Lyriq, and Vistik. And just this year, GM announced $275 million more to add Chevrolet Blazer production in 2027, plus a new gas-powered Cadillac. Sit with that arithmetic for a second. General Motors found more money to keep this building running under someone else's badge than it was ever willing to spend keeping the original badge alive. Over $4 billion in investment since 2010, against a fraction of that spent trying to save Saturn's own lineup in the 2000s. The plant didn't die from lack of investment. The brand did. When the wind down finished in 2010, about 13,000 dealership jobs were affected, some absorbed into other GM franchises down the street, many just gone. Spring Hill's production workforce wasn't scattered the way a closure would scatter it. GM simply shifted the labor toward other products at the same site, and the team-based manufacturing culture Saturn pioneered quietly bled into how GM runs its other lines today. Saturn owners were told to take their cars to any GM dealer from now on. And the flower, the one Saturn handed every customer at the service counter, the tiny gesture that summed up an entire philosophy about how a car company should treat the people who trusted it, just quietly stopped. Nobody announced its end. It simply wasn't there one day. Drive through Spring Hill today, and you'll find a town whose entire modern identity, its schools, its roads, its population growth, was built around a company whose name doesn't appear on a single building there anymore. The homecoming reunions, once tens of thousands of owners driving in from every state, simply stopped happening. And the no-haggle pricing model Saturn invented as a radical, countercultural idea in 1990, it's now standard practice at dealerships across the entire industry, so completely absorbed into how Americans buy cars that almost nobody buying a car today has any idea where it came from. That's its own quiet victory and its own quiet erasure happening at the same time. Saturn won the argument it set out to win, that customers deserved a fairer way to buy a car. So completely that the argument disappeared into the background of the whole industry and took Saturn's name down with it. The story of Saturn was never really about Saturn. It's about what happens when a corporation tries to build something genuinely independent inside itself and discovers at the first real moment of financial pressure that it never actually let go of the leash. GM gave Saturn its own factory, its own radical labor deal, its own dealer network, its own name, and kept every meaningful lever of financial control in a boardroom 400 miles away, the entire time. For a decade, that produced something remarkable. A brand new American car company that beat Toyota and Honda on customer trust with nothing but a fair price and a handshake. But independence that only exists at a parent company's pleasure was never really independence. It was a loan, extended on easy terms during the good years, and called due the second things got hard. In 2009, in the middle of its own bankruptcy, General Motors called that loan. There were dozens of moments across 2 decades where this could have gone differently. A redesign shipped a year earlier, a second buyer chased a little harder in the fall of 2009. And at almost every single one of those moments, GM made the same choice. Protect the parent company's balance sheet first and treat the subsidiaries' independence as negotiable the second it became inconvenient. Spring Hill manufacturing is still there. The overhead systems Roger Smith's engineers installed in the 1980s are, in large part, still running today. Upgraded, retooled, repurposed, but standing exactly where they were built. Right now, a robot arm on that line is probably welding a panel onto a Cadillac, on the exact stretch of floor where a Saturn SL2 once rolled toward a customer who'd drive it 400 miles back, 8 months later, just to say thank you in person. The factory remembers what it was built to do. The company that built it made a different choice